Hello, my name is Michael James Melnyk. I'm the author of a two-volume history of the Galician Division. Today I'll be talking about the second volume, entitled Stalin's Nemesis. The second volume, Stalin's Nemesis, begins after the Battle of Brody, when the division was reformed in September 1944, and it culminates in the 1950s after the survivors of the division had been brought to the UK and ultimately freed. Essentially, the history of the division after Brody was as follows. The unit was reformed predominantly from conscripted personnel, so there's a distinct difference between the makeup of the initial formation and the formation which came into existence after the Battle of Brody in July 1944. To replenish the ranks of the division, the Germans resorted to conscription. As they withdrew from Western Ukraine, they notified the local population anybody between the ages of 16 and 60, any male, would be taken into service, either as forced labour or conscripted to the military unit, as was the case with my father, who was taken at gunpoint on the 22nd of June or 21st of June 1944 from his home village of Koropets. So the division was reformed. I said this time it never really had the ardent nationalist core that it previously had. There was a residual element of that, but that obviously was diluted by virtue of the enormous losses sustained at the Battle of Brody. The first action the division was involved in after it was reformed was it was dispatched to Slovakia, where an element, a Kampfgruppe or battle group, was involved in the suppression of the Slovak uprising. Subsequent to that, the entire division was sent to Slovakia for garrison duty, where it remained until late January, early February 1944. The division then marched from Slovakia to its new base, which was going to be in Slovenia, where it undertook action against Tito's communist partisans. There was some question as to whether or not the division would be disarmed when Hitler discovered the existence of the division. Ultimately, it was only temporarily disarmed. The weapons were reissued, and the last part of the war saw the division fighting at the front against the Red Army in Austria. Subsequent to that, the division surrendered. The bulk of the division surrendered to the British in Austria, who had advanced up through Italy, while a smaller part, approximately 1,200 men or thereabouts, surrendered to the Americans. The division the residual elements of the division were then taken to Rimini, those that had surrendered to the British. They were held in Italy, in Rimini, for 2 years before being brought back to the United Kingdom, where they were interned for an additional 2 years before ultimately being freed. July 1944, the division had been trained sufficiently and equipped sufficiently to be sent to the front line. Initially, the division was to have been deployed in a secondary area near Culminates, but there was a change of plan at the 11th hour. The Russians had launched their summer offensive, which was simply devastating. The division was moved to the Brody front, where it was part of the 13th Army Corps, deployed along with four German units, and after 10 days of fighting, the better part of 7,000 men were missing or killed, or had deserted. There were approximately 3,000 men who had returned to the division's training camp in the immediate aftermath of the battle. That figure probably rose a little, but in essence, 7,000 men, 7,000 well-trained men were lost either to desertion, to death, or were captured by the Soviets during the battle. So a year and a half's worth of training was undone in 10 days of fighting. What happened was, in the immediate aftermath of the battle, there were only approximately 3,500 men, say, who returned to the division. In order to deploy the division, you needed the division at full strength, which was approximately 12,000 to 15,000 men. There were Ukrainians like my father who'd been conscripted during the summer period, and they were taken to the reserve regiment. The reserve regiment at that time, I believe, had a strength of about 5,000 men. So they were civilians taken immediately into military. They were conscripted into the military formation, and they were given their basic training in a reserve regiment. So the 3,000 odd men, the core survivors of the Battle of Brody, were supplemented with the 5,000 to 7,000 men from the reserve regiment, and the division was reformed. So it wasn't immediately deployable because it didn't exist. It had to be reformed. But the reformation of the division took place in a 6-week period between August and September 1944. Then it could be deployed, and then it was deployed to Slovakia. From the moment the division was formed until the moment the division was disbanded, there was always a prominent UPA presence within the division. That presence took the form of a number of key individuals who occupied positions within the division where they could exercise some kind of political control and influence on the rank and file. So even after Brody, the vast majority of the Ukrainians remained ardent nationalists and supporting the UPA. Because Brody pretty much marked the high watermark of when the division was deployed, in as much as from then on, the Germans or the Axis forces did not occupy any of Ukraine. They were forced out of it altogether. So immediate contact with the UPA was necessarily limited. However, the agents within the division, people such as Bohdan Pidhayny, still received instructions from the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, who were also involved with the UPA, which was their military arm. So the link was maintained, but it wasn't as prevalent as it had been before the Battle of Brody. So when the division was initially reformed, it had a very short time period, 6 weeks or thereabouts, and the division wasn't really combat fit. So a battle group formed around a nucleus of personnel who had been at Brody, experienced people, was dispatched to Slovakia to take part in the suppression of the Slovak uprising. That Slovak uprising was backed by the Soviets. So you had Red Army personnel parachuted into Slovakia to support them. So after the battle group arrived, it was operational for about 4 weeks or thereabouts, and the remainder of the division was dispatched to Slovakia. The purpose of the division, when it was stationed in Slovakia, was garrison duties. They protected the main arterial transportation routes, they protected factories, they patrolled units, and they undertook anti-partisan actions again against the Soviet-backed partisans in Slovakia. The relationship between the division's personnel, and the local population was exemplary. I've had a large number of veterans will tell me that the best time they ever spent in the division was when they were based in Slovakia. Similar language, similar culture. There was a reasonable Ukrainian presence in Slovakia prior to that time. Some even found relatives there. But they had, it was a good place for them to be. They were happy, and they felt as though their culture was acknowledged by the people they were living with. When circumstances dictated, the division was required in Slovenia. There was no transportation available for the rank and file, and they had to march. It took the better part of a month for the division to march from Slovakia, where they had previously been, as I said, engaged in garrison duty, to fight in what was Yugoslavia against Tito's communist partisans. The Germans always had trouble trying to control them. So the unit arrived there in early February, and it fought the conflict. The engagements it had with them were completely different to the anti-partisan duties which had been undertaken in Slovakia. In Slovakia, culture was the same, similar. Languages were similar. They had similar religious beliefs and convictions. In Slovenia, it was an entirely new ball game. They found that the communist partisans of Tito were ruthless. They didn't have any respect, and it was what you might call gloves off. It was really quite brutal warfare that they engaged in there against them. Then from Slovenia, they stayed there approximately a month, and ultimately, I said, after the incident where the division was to be disarmed, It wasn't fully disarmed. It was, however, redeployed in Austria, where it engaged the Red Army in the area of Gleichenberg and Stradner Kogel in the east of the country. I think because prior to Brody, most of the activity involved training. After Brody, most of the activity involved deployment, Slovakia, Slovenia, the March, Austria. So it was easier to get people to talk about those things because there was more for them to remember. It wasn't the mundane, routine military drill which they'd been accustomed to prior to that. So I would say, as a rule, it was easier to find people to talk about their experiences after Brody. So let me tell you something about this. Even after 25 years, it just doesn't work that way. In the first instance, you have to be introduced to the veteran, whoever he may be. You then have to spend probably anything up to about 2 hours revealing your credentials, or you won't get a word. You have to say who you are, what you're doing. You have to give an account of your personal involvement. You have to effectively provide proof of your intention. Then, as a rule, when you start to interview somebody, a veteran, about specific aspects, it's almost like a game of chess. You have to tell them what you know and allow them to expand or fill in the blanks. So it isn't that they're forthcoming and they invite you in and give you a cup of tea and they're immediately happy to tell you everything they know. It's, generally speaking, it's measured. It's circumspect. There's a degree of reluctance for people to talk about things because I said some of the things they saw and experienced weren't particularly pleasant. But after maybe an hour, then you begin to establish some kind of rapport. When they know you know as much as you do, it becomes easier for them to elaborate on certain aspects, and you can be more specific about what it is you want to know. So you'll begin with a general introduction. They'll tell you one or two things that aren't necessarily important, and as they talk to you more and more, they discover that you know more than perhaps they think that you do, and on that basis they tend to open up a bit more. So it isn't an all-embracing immediate friendship, but that it simply doesn't happen that way at all. I wish it did, but it doesn't. The tragedy, or one of the tragedies of the Galician Division, the Galichina Division, was that it was that the enlisted personnel were Western Ukrainians. It didn't matter what title you gave them, whether you called them Galician or not. The fact is they were Western Ukrainians. When they were deployed against the Red Army, some of them found that they were deployed against Ukrainians who'd been conscripted into the Red Army. So in some instances, a son who had been conscripted into the Galician Division found himself confronted with his father, who had been conscripted into the Soviet Army. So you had a number of incidents which were relayed to me by survivors and veterans, whereby they had relatives fighting on the other side, which must have been exceptionally difficult for them to cope with. From what I can gather, in most instances, when that occurred, whoever was in the Soviet side came over to the German side. I don't recall any examples where somebody deserted from the Galician Division to join the Soviets. It was more the other way. But yes, they were acutely aware that they were fighting against their countrymen, which is something they clearly didn't want to do. And there were instances where Ukrainians were captured at the Battle of Brody. A great number were shot out of hand. But there were specific examples that I can recall where Ukrainians were captured by Ukrainians who dealt with them very leniently on the basis that they were Ukrainians themselves and they understood that this was one of their countrymen as well. I think when the division was deployed in combat, wherever it was deployed in combat, for example, at Brody on the Eastern Front where it faced the Russians, or later in Austria where it also faced the Soviet army, you had a situation where you had people conscripted into both sides confronting each other. And they could have been family members, they could have been friends, but either way, they were Ukrainians. For the vast majority, I don't think they really discussed or thought about ideals. The basic thing was they found themselves fighting against somebody from their own country with whom they had no quarrel. They were all victim of circumstance in as much as they were fighting either in a German uniform or a Soviet uniform, the vast majority not even necessarily through choice. So I think it is more just the basic pragmatics of how can I survive rather than an ideal. Certainly at the end of the war, when the division was deployed in Austria against the Red Army, I would say the Ukrainians believed, the Ukrainians fighting on the German side believed ultimately that the division would be recognized or would be helped, would be a pillar in the formation of Ukrainian National Army, which would help ultimately establish Ukrainian political independence. So those fighting on the Soviet side and the Red Army would have been aware of that. But I think as for the relationship between the two sides, it was far more essential in as much as it was simply about survival and about making contact with people that you knew rather than political ideals. The division was deployed as a regular frontline combat unit on two occasions, once at Brody and once in Austria at the end of the war against the Red Army. In the interim, it was deployed against partisan units. That's the first thing. The second thing is, at the end of the war, the divisional war diaries and records were burnt and destroyed. So there are no immediate records to refer to. You have to rebuild the jigsaw puzzle, which has been shattered, so to speak. Because they realized that if they fell into the hands of the Soviets, they would be repatriated, or the information would be potentially incriminating against family members in Ukraine, which is unfortunate for me because all the critical documentation that I would want was set fire to a couple of weeks before the end of the war. Division was deployed in Austria early April 1945, where it engaged with the Red Army, and the casualties were significant. I would estimate somewhere in the region of 2,000 men or thereabouts, which is a significant part of the division. The war finished the 8th of May in Europe, and the division retreated towards the Allied lines. As I said, it split. An element of it, a smaller element, surrendered to the Americans, but the bulk of the division surrendered to the British. The British moved it to Rimini in Italy, northern Italy, where it is kept on an old airfield. It was interned. My thinking is, and the evidence that I have suggests that the British wanted to utilize the division if there was, in the advent of another outbreak of hostilities between the Western Allies and the Soviets, in which case the division represented, as it was, a well-trained anti-Soviet unit which could be deployed immediately. I think the initial estimation was 20 divisions would be required, and by keeping the division in Italy, if the deployment was necessary, it would have been far easier to deploy the division there than it would have from anywhere else. It was held in Italy for 2 years by the British. Then it was brought back to the United Kingdom, still as prisoners of war. They were held in camps in the United Kingdom for 2 years. During that period, some enlisted for clandestine operations behind the Soviet lines, which were backed by the British Secret Service, MI6. Some were involved in mine clearing operations for the British authorities, which continued up to 1986. But in the mid-50s, they were freed, allowed to travel to parts of the Commonwealth. Some went to America, some went to Canada, Australia, some went to Argentina, and some remained in the United Kingdom. When the division was deployed at Brody, and the remnants were retreating after the battle, a number of them, rather than retreat to the German lines, joined the UPA units. It's very difficult to put a specific number on that, but I would estimate perhaps as many as 2,000. Then the division, as we've discussed, was deployed in Slovakia. And a number of people, a number of the soldiers, deserted because Slovakia is quite strategically close to Ukraine. Those who did desert, the vast majority, wanted to join up with the UPA. And the same thing applied when the division was transferred to Slovenia and to Austria. Lots of the desertions that took place were so people could join the UPA. That what they wanted to do was to fight for a military organization that they knew to be entirely representative of Ukrainian nationalist aspirations. So from the outset, when training began in Heidelberg until the very end of the war, desertions occurred, and the rationale behind the desertion was to try and get back to Ukraine or to wherever UPA units were operational and to join them. As I said, after the division was reformed, it was deployed in Slovakia. The division was deployed there. Initially, the battle group undertook operations against the Slovak uprising. Later, the entire division was moved there where they undertook garrison duty. Now, what really did surprise me, because this was a posting that nobody has asked for, that the Germans strategically decided they needed, what really surprised me was the relationship between the members of the division and the Slovak population. It was almost as if they were welcomed by family. And what has surprised me even more than that, that still applies today. I've had the good fortune to meet a number of Slovaks when I've been visiting the country, who have very fond memories of the Ukrainians, stayed in contact with them after the war, and have nothing but good things to say about them. And given that they were there essentially as part of an occupation force, I found that quite extraordinary, that there's still such a warmth of feeling between the Slovaks and the Ukrainian soldiers. The Ukrainians will often say that the time that they enjoyed the most during their military service was when they were deployed in Slovakia. And that's been proven by umpteen examples of letters and the fact that I know that they maintained contact with people in the country long after the war. But when I went there myself and I spoke to the local inhabitants who'd had communication, and even the children of those who had lived at the time when the division was deployed there, had viewed the division very favorably. Their conduct, the way they behaved, the similarities, and I found that extraordinary given the circumstances. I would estimate worldwide the number of surviving veterans can't exceed 100. The only conclusion I've reached thus far, after 25 years of research, is I haven't done enough. I simply haven't done enough. The division has to represent a historical legacy. It has to represent an example. Those that served in the division have nothing to be ashamed of at all. I think what needs to be done is we need to collect the information, everything which is available. I still regularly get emails and communications from children of veterans who know as much about the subject as I did when I started, which was virtually nothing. And they want to know and they need to know because it's very personal. I think for the sake of the community in this country and abroad, and certainly in Ukraine itself, I think we have a debt and we have a responsibility to collect as much information as we possibly can, because there's a great deal that I couldn't get access to at the time for one reason or another. I think there's a burden or a responsibility to make an effort to try and recover as much of that information as possible and to continue to publish more information about the division for the sake of the generations to come. The areas which I never gave as much, it wasn't that I didn't devote enough time to. For example, the operations of those who enlisted to undertake the mine clearance in the United Kingdom after they came here as POWs. Unfortunately, the whole episode was secret. Even the people who participated signed the Official Secrets Act. The vast majority are reluctant to give any information at all. The British Archives is not forthcoming in terms of any information about names, locations, or dates. I know there were casualties. I know it was extremely risky work, and I know some of the people involved in it. It's something that I think should be acknowledged. But the only way I'm going to get additional information is if somebody who took part in that operation would be prepared to come and talk to me. I think after all this time, the Official Secrets Act itself shouldn't be a bar to somebody saying, well, okay, I did this, because they're near the end of their life in any case. But that's one aspect I would like to explore. In the same way, the potential use of the division as an anti-Soviet element in the event of an outbreak with hostilities with the Soviet Union, Operation Unthinkable. The people that were involved in the clandestine operations that took place, they were trained by the British Secret Service, some in England, some in Germany, and parachuted behind Soviet lines. Again, that's something which, because there is no immediate information available, it's just hearsay or who you know and who's prepared to tell you and give you whatever they've got. If you don't, you can ask, but if it's not forthcoming, then it's something that you can't give sufficient space to. But the tragedy of what I've done is I haven't done enough, because I know there's a lot more material in private hands. Had I had that material, I could have done a better job. I was limited by what I could get access to. You cannot force people to cooperate. That's correct. However, I feel that I was not sufficiently able to persuade some people to cooperate. And that's a fault. If I know, for example, have known over the course of years certain individuals who hold material which would have been absolutely key material, marvelous, really critical photographic, documentary material, or whatever. And despite the fact I knew that they had the material and they knew I knew they had it, I was unable to persuade them to release it to me. So I suppose that's something I feel fairly self-critical about, because if I had persuaded them successfully, it would have enhanced significantly the material I had already collected. So you can't make people do things, but you can. I think you need to persuade people one way or another, not because it's in my interests, but because it's in the interests of the Ukrainian nation, the recording of the history of the Ukrainian nation. I contacted them. Most often I spoke to them directly on the telephone, explained who I was. I sent them copies of the work that I'd done, specific questions. I told them I'd return the material to them, but they simply wouldn't part with it. But when you're aware of the material and you're not able, as a researcher, and you realize the importance of that material and you're not able to obtain it, you do regard it as a failing. For whatever reason, it's something that you feel bad about, because you know, had you had it, you could have produced something significantly better than you did. What I'd like to share is, if we want to continue with this, if we want to produce an additional volume, if we want to answer the questions that have yet to be answered, we need to find the material, either myself or somebody else, and we need to collate it, we need to process it, and we need to present it. And that I can only undertake as much as I can do without the assistance and the help of other people. Obviously, the result is going to be necessarily limited. What I need is the cooperation of anyone who's got a vested interest in the subject, so we can communicate, we can help each other, and we can produce something which will be mutually beneficial, and hopefully which will be an asset and part of the legacy of the Ukrainian nation. 50%. 50% is missing. I was able to document fairly accurately the military activities of the division from when it was formed in April 1943 until cessation of hostilities May 1945. However, the entire period after the war, which is critical, is the part which is least documented. And that's the part I'd like to concentrate on now. You can gain more from cooperating. You can achieve more collectively. And in order to achieve more in that way, you have to make contacts, you have to communicate with people, you have to agree on what your end game is going to be, you have to have a passion for something, and then you have to have the desire and enthusiasm to see it through to the end. I haven't finished the task that I've set myself, although I really don't want to be doing all of my life. I can see that because I know how time consuming and expensive it can be. But I would like to make a final attempt, and it is probably going to be my final attempt before I pass the baton on to somebody else, to make one last stab at finding the bits I couldn't find first or second time round. then that's enough. Somebody else can have a go. But it isn't really about that. It's about why I'm living in the UK. To some extent, it's about why your family are living where they are. So it's the course of events that brought us to where we are. That's got to be the starting point. That has to be the departure point, doesn't it? Why are we here? We're here because of this event. So let's look at that event, and then we'll gradually get more and more detailed in our analysis of that. Okay, it's good to speak to you. Bye-bye.